We begin at the bronze statue of Giordano Bruno. Megan Williams is standing at its feet as we speak. Megan is a writer and broadcaster who lives in Rome. Hey, Bella.
Ciao, Bella. Come stai?
I'm good. You're in Campo de Fiori. Set the scene for us. What do you see all around you?
Well, I'm in the Campo de Fiori piazza, which is a really historic square in the center of Rome, and I'm actually standing in the piazza at an interesting moment. It's almost 4:00 in the afternoon here, and it's sort of between its two uses. In the morning, it's this vibrant, bustling market where it sells, fresh oranges and artichokes and all sorts of local produce. And then in the afternoon, the market clears out, which is the scene that I'm looking at right now, and the young people come in. So it's a real hot spot for teenagers, university students in Rome.
So in the midst of all of this, day or night, this place is so full of life. And here's this statue of a man who was burned at the stake. What's your first impression when you come upon the statue of Giordano Bruno?
It's a very foreboding kind of statue. It's bronze, and it's of a hooded Bruno grasping a book, which is the book of his philosophy, which led to him being burnt at the stake. And his head is shadowed by a hood, and he's looking very grim. Right now, actually, he's got some pigeon drop on his nose, so that provides some comic relief. But, it's a funny contrast to the piazza because the scene around it is usually so lively and so full of life. And then there's this heavy reminder of something so tragic from the past.
I've read that his face is forever in shadow. Is the sun shining in Rome now? Is he in shadow at the moment?
Most of the statue is in the sunlight and reflecting the sunlight, except for his face. And you really have to kind of get up close and stand right underneath the statue to see his features. Very, heavy brow. He, as I said, he's not looking particularly happy. Interestingly enough, he's staring in the direction of the apostolic penitentiary, which apparently was done on purpose. The apostolic penitentiary is sort of a formidable travertine edifice just beyond the piazza, which was the Vatican courthouse where he was tried and then, afterwards burnt as a result.
Megan, you mentioned an inscription. Would you read that for us?
Yeah, the inscription, it's in bronze, and it's right in front of the statue, and it's above the heads of the tourists and young people who are sitting there now having their snacks. And it says, I'll read it in Italian first, it says, A Bruno, il secolo da lui divinato qui dove il rogo arse. And the translation is, to Bruno, from the generations he foresaw, here, where the pyre burnt.
I haven't been there in a long time, but I've never forgotten seeing this statue in the middle of this lively, gorgeous, vibrant piazza. And here's this figure, almost melancholy, almost reproachful.
Yeah.
Can you just say a little bit about the contrast between the life of the place and the mood of this figure?
You're right. It's a very strong contrast. And particularly the fact that this was an incredibly serious, deep-thinking person who, in the end, stuck by his principles and died for them. And, when I look at the scene here with the orange peels and the artichoke leaves and the lettuce leaves strewn about it, there's pigeons all over the place. There's a little garbage truck moving along. And then all these young people starting to come in. Nobody really paying attention to poor old Bruno standing in the middle. I mean, it's sort of the lightness of modern life compared to the heavy choices that some people made in the past, in order to bring us to a point where we have freedom of thought and freedom of religion.
Beautifully put. Megan, it's so good to talk to you again. Thank you.
Wonderful to talk to you, Mary.
A più tardi.
A più tardi.
Okay, bye.
Thanks. Ciao, ciao.
Giordano Bruno was an extremely radical thinker in his time. He doubted the divinity of Jesus and the virginity of Mary. He believed the universe was filled with other planets capable of supporting life. This 16th-century man, who started out as a Dominican friar, was eventually labeled a heretic by the Vatican. He was also a poet, playwright, teacher, and a bit of a ladies' man. No wonder Bruno is adored in the chaotic city of Rome. No wonder he's adored by Ingrid Rowland. Rowland is a professor at the University of Notre Dame's School of Architecture in Rome. She is the author of Giordano Bruno, Philosopher, Heretic. Hi, Professor Rowland.
Hi.
This is the only time all hour that I'm going to ask you for a sound bite. If I came up to you and said, Giordano Bruno, never heard of him, what would you say? How would you describe him in a nutshell?
That one is actually really hard because in some ways he's an impossible man, but he's also a visionary. And basically I think of him as the man who could stand in a jail cell of the Inquisition and point out the window and show his cellmates the stars and say each one of those is a world. It's a man of incredible self-possession.
Was that poetic license, or did that happen? Do we
that
know
actually happened? And
so
we
he
have
was in
records.
his cell. He was in his cell during the Inquisition.
That's in a cell that was in Venice. It was torn down by Napoleon deliberately. And he had from 5 to 6 cellmates, and the cellmates reported that he'd take them to the window and point out and say, each one of those stars is a world. And there's several cellmates who testified to this.
As I look at the picture of him, the picture of his statue displayed on the cover of your book, it's almost like a glowing sun with this figure of Giordano Bruno in the bronze. We're talking about a bronze statue of a guy in a robe standing over the marketplace in Campo de Fiori in central Rome. It's a statue. Why does it have such a powerful effect on people?
I think it's partly the contrast between the brutality that took place in that same piazza, which was an execution ground in the old days as well as a market, and the fact that this man was one of the people who really was burned at the Inquisition's stake because of his ideas. He hadn't killed anybody, he hadn't hurt anybody. All he did is say that the universe was infinitely large. And he said that he'd always had problems with calling Jesus the second person of the Holy Trinity, and because he said that he questioned the Inquisition's right to judge him. He was put up, actually, by the students of the University of Rome after the unification of Italy, which happened when, in 1870, Italy militarily won independence from the Papal State. So there's also a great political idea behind the statue.
What can you tell me about the placement of the statue in the piazza? Because this is so full of symbolism. It was to face the sun, then it did not face the sun. It now faces the Vatican. What's the backstory behind the physical orientation of this Giordano Bruno bronze?
Originally, he was supposed to face the sun because the sun is central to his thinking, or he thinks a lot about light, and God is light. He remained, I think, religious to the very end, although that's been questioned. And he'd have his back turned to the Vatican. Originally, in the 1880s, he was placed in the place of his execution along with the statue of Martin Luther, so that both of these, in a way, were really upraised fists against the Vatican. And the Pope finally objected to having Bruno turn his back, and so now Bruno stares down the Vatican.
But I gather the effect of that, or one effect of that, is that Bruno's face, his whole head, which is shrouded in the hood of the sculpture, his face is forever in shadow. Is that true?
That's really true. In any light conditions, any time of the year, he's always in shadow. And shadows actually are important in his thinking because he thinks that the world around us is a whole series of shadows. That there's never pure light, everything's always shades of gray, and somehow it's appropriate.
I gather the sculptor was a fairly big believer in artistic license. You point out Giordano Bruno hadn't worn Dominican robes and a hood for almost 25 years by the time he was put to death. But this was a really good call, it seems. What is it about the robe and the hood covering Bruno's face? There's something very haunting about this man, about this image.
And I think somehow it does take him back to his origins, and it also makes a man who is physically very slight look much bigger. And the statue itself is huge. The sketch for it in plaster is still in the Museum of Modern Art, and you can walk right up to it, and then you realize how gigantic it really is. But somehow in the marketplace, he's reduced. He seems the size of any of us.
What about his expression? When you look at his face in the statue, the expression, I mean, it's certainly not one of terror. I don't think it's one of defiance. What do you see when you look into his face?
Yeah, I think he's already passed into another world because he believed that after death he would simply decompose atomically and recompose in some other form. And in a way, I think he's there awaiting his transformation into the next stage of his existence.
Would he have had that degree of equanimity as he was burned at the stake? Would he have had that kind of transcendental calm?
That's the big question. He was gagged just in case he had enough composure to say something really eloquent. Most people, of course, didn't, because when you're burned alive, it's one of the most horrific things that can happen. But just in case, they made sure he couldn't say anything. The last gesture we know he made is when he was shown a little panel painting of the crucifix. And gagged as he was, the only kind of expression of defiance he could possibly make was to turn his face away with what's called a fierce expression in the eyewitness account.
And yet he was, in a sense, a believer, you think, until the end of his days.
Yeah, I think he certainly believed in God. There was a God that was anything but the big man in the sky. He thought God was a kind of world soul that permeated a universe that was infinite in extent.
A world soul.
And he sometimes talks about God being the soul of the world. So that he's always deeply in Platonic territory, even when he's gone far beyond Plato's cosmology.
I'm intrigued by the city of Naples, what role the city of Naples played in shaping Giordano Bruno. What was it about the city, about Naples, that shaped him, that helped turn him into this poet, philosopher, believer, mystical guy?
I always think it's that combination of utter chaos and extreme beauty that you get in Naples. So you have Vesuvius looming over everything, and this dramatic landscape that's all the lips of ancient volcanic craters, and then this beautiful curve of the bay, so that you've got humanity contrasted with the might of nature. Nature's just so staggeringly powerful.
When I think of Naples, apart from the beauty, I think of the chaos. And it's so cool that one of Bruno's central ideas was that God is going to be found in the noise, in the confusion, in the smell of everyday life, in the very chaos, rather than in some rarefied, sanctified, cleansed world of ideas. To what extent is that a Naples that shaped him? Just Naples the noisy, Naples the seat of chaos?
And I think especially because he got there as a teenager, it must have been overwhelming. And the impressions that we get when we're teenagers are so intense. And we keep them really forever. And somehow I think, even though he may not have been a sophisticated thinker when he got there, he was so sensitive to all these stimuli that was his world.
So when you think of him, do you think of a teacher? Do you think of a philosopher? Do you think of a writer? If you were to describe the essence of the man, quite apart from his ideas, I'm almost looking more for his occupation, for the way he moved through the world.
Certainly what I respond to is the writer, and that may simply be because it's all we have of him. We don't really know what he was like to be around except from very few records. One of his friends said he was great to have at dinner. One of his students said he was an amazing teacher, but they're half sentences talking about what he was like. And so our only way to get at him in a way is to read him and then see the places where he was, know something about the philosophies that affected him. But he obviously was somebody who took a real physical joy in living, and he probably was a lot of fun. Much of the time he had a terrible temper, but I can also see that he had exasperating people all around him at all times. And I actually got to him partly because I was reading his caricature of boring academics and just started laughing because it seemed like the experience that we all have.
Well, he was skewering your world, right?
Yes. And when I first read him, I was an assistant professor, and so it was perfect. And he felt exactly the way I did, and we were about the same age, so it was total identification.
This is Tapestry.
Many of the real religious experiences of our time are not happening in church.
It happened to me in a gym. A woman said to me, "Turn over."
They're happening in discotheques, they're happening in public squares.
And I turned over and there was this light over my head. Bang! Like that.
I'm Mary Hines. My guest is Ingrid Rowland. Rowland is a professor at the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture in Rome. She is the author of Giordano Bruno, Philosopher, Heretic. Let's talk about Giordano the playwright. Giordano Bruno wrote a play about life in Naples called The Candlemaker, Il Candelaio. And the signature line is, Il mondo sta bene come sta. The world is fine as it is. And I found this so baffling when I read it. The world is fine as it is. This is not the calling card of someone who has come to be a rabble-rouser, who has come to light a fire under the world. Is he being complacent here? What's he saying with this message of, the world is just fine. It's fine just the way it is?
Yeah, I think he must be thinking about that sovereign mechanism of the world, and that everything that we're seeing as chaotic are small bugs in a giant system. So that it's the way that if Vesuvius erupts, it's part of a great natural cycle. It's not because everybody in Naples was bad and God's punishing them. That he's thinking of world in a much bigger scale, so that in a way, our existence is like an ant who gets squashed as you're walking down the street.
But the ant still gets squashed. Would he have found some comfort in that cosmic view?
I hope so, because I'm also baffled in the injustices that he calls attention to in that play, where you have these women, and the woman who says that the world is fine as it is a prostitute, with everything that implies for her life history and what she actually does for a living. And what she says in that same speech is, better make money now because pretty soon I'm going to shrivel up. His purse is going to shrivel up. We better be nice to our gentleman friends while they take an interest in us. It's profoundly cynical, or it seems to be, and yet I think he doesn't think in a cynical way, ultimately.
When I read that bit, I was struck by the empathy, because here is this Dominican, well, at one point, I guess, a priest, a Dominican scholar, Dominican philosopher, and he's writing with such a tender heart about the plight of the prostitute who's just getting too old to turn the trick. I mean, it was just, there was something really, really strange about that.
Then there's a whole question about Bruno's relationship with women, because one of his other dialogues starts out with this tirade against women. And a lot of people have read this as Bruno hates women, when in fact I think he's quite sympathetic to them, as I think Plato in his own day was sympathetic to them. That both of these men were extremely radical in seeing human beings as human beings with a kind of openness that their societies didn't have.
We've touched on his years as a Dominican friar, and it's very striking to learn about life among the Dominicans in Naples 400 years ago. Because
it's not what we think.
Not really. You've got your knife fights, you've got your all-nighters, you've got your paternity suits. I felt like you're pulling the curtain back on some really skanky frat house somewhere.
And I love the guy going around the piazza with the irate husband chasing him with a rake. Yeah,
that was a good one, too. There he is in his robes trying to get away from the irate husband. How would Bruno have been shaped by his time at this? This was San Domenico, which was a very upper-crust religious house of the Dominicans, where Giordano Bruno spent a number of years. How was he shaped by this environment?
I think, first of all, he learned to move with the absolute top elite, so that one of the things that...
I thought you were going to say he learned to move really quickly.
Yeah, that too. I always wonder, especially in these days when we're finding out that so many religious houses have beaten up schoolboys, and beating up schoolboys was standard practice in the Renaissance. But you wonder how much he was brutalized by schoolmasters. I assume enough to make him really angry. But he also learned a whole class hierarchy based on intellect, in which he, as one of the star pupils, was at the absolute top. And it allowed him, every time that he moved someplace, to go right to, if not the ruler in person, at least the ruler's inner circle, and see whether he could get a job, so that he actually met, we assume, Elizabeth I. He certainly was an intimate of King Henri III in Paris. He met the electors in various German city-states. And I think that's why they wanted to make sure that his execution took place at dawn and rather quickly.
Because he had friends?
Because he might have friends.
And this was on the strength of his mind, on the strength of his intellect.
This because he seems to have been lower-level gentry. His father was a professional soldier, and his mother came from what seems to have been an eccentric family that lived on the outskirts of Nola, which is a teeny-tiny town. It's right under the shadow of Vesuvius.
Yes.
So he's not coming from anywhere particular. The only thing that he has is his own ability to use his mind.
The touch of fate seems to hover just over his story throughout his entire life, and it seems that Giordano Bruno was always making the choice that would take him further into trouble. Does his life read like a story of destiny to you? Am I being just too fanciful with this, or do you get a sense of that pull?
No, and I always think that maybe the whole solution to his life is that if he'd come along to Naples 10 years later, he probably would have gone into the Society of Jesus instead of the Dominicans, and that would have been fine. That if he'd been a Jesuit, probably that order could have dealt with him.
Here's what I find really poignant, that 400 years after Bruno was burned at the stake, you, his biographer, can say, Well, he was certainly a martyr to something, but a martyr to what? What do you think his martyrdom was about?
Free thought, basically. I think his real issue with the Inquisition and what makes every cardinal on the Inquisition board go ballistic is his questioning of their authority to sit in judgment of him. I've always thought that the trial he underwent, which dragged out over 7 years, and ended up with him facing down the person who was supposed to be the greatest living theologian, the fact that the two of them went at it when one of them has just been made cardinal and the other one's been in prison for 7 years. And that must have been a debate that was incredible.
Was this Bellarmine?
It was Bellarmine, and the fact that Bruno held his own against Bellarmine is testimony to an extraordinary mind.
If you are going to be a martyr, and 4 centuries after you die, it's not clear what you were really a martyr to in the public mind, what a waste. Does it strike you as a waste?
Yeah, it's true, and I think he did have a problem explaining himself to people, and he'd lose his patience when they turned out to be slow. And as a veteran teacher, I can understand that, where you think you've said it and your students are looking completely blank. And then you just have to swallow your pride and see if you could rephrase it. And he wouldn't swallow his pride. He'd get mad. He was a volatile Southerner. And he'd wave his hands, and that made it worse.
You know, this is, I think, the third time you've talked about, or you've hinted at a kind of kinship you've felt with Giordano Bruno in some element of being a teacher or being impatient or having to deal with these moronic young students. Did you feel a kind of, was there a soulmate element of this for you? Did you feel a kind of kinship with this long-gone philosopher?
Yeah, and especially as a writer, because I've just finished translating his longest and in many ways most difficult Italian dialogue on the heroic frenzies, which has, among other things, 75 poems. And that was just fun because I wrote a lot of doggerel in my youth. And so, again, there's this kind of identification, also because the standards for run-on sentences and unbridled rhetoric back then were different than now, so that it's a way of letting yourself really go rhetorically, which I can't do in my own English writing. I've learned over the years to cut out every other adjective.
Yeah.
And it's really much better that way.
But when you mention the run-on sentence, I'm reminded of something, a piece of Bruno's writing, the one that begins, Jove, Mercury has ordered that today at noon 2 of the melons in Father Francino's melon patch will be ripe, but they won't be picked until 3 days ago. The Vasta, the wife of Albanio, when she means to curl her hair at the temples, shall burn 57 hairs for having let the curling iron get too hot. This goes on for pages and pages and pages. In that moment, a cuckoo shall be heard from La Starza, cuckooing 12 times, whereupon it will fly away and fly to the ruins of Castel da Cicola. This goes on for pages, hinting at a divine force that's at work in the most minute areas of human life. Was that a spoof or a belief of his, do you think?
I think it's really a belief, and then he's carrying it to spoof. But just because he makes fun of it doesn't mean he doesn't believe it. So it's like Aristophanes making fun of Athens. And in fact, he loves Athens with every fiber of his being.
Yes.
I just think these writers can see every side of things.
So would this have been part of Giordano Bruno's view of the divine, something that has this degree of watchfulness over every minute going on the earth, whether creature, animal, insect, person?
I suppose, as the psalm says, he watches over the sparrow, and therefore he watches over me.
Yes.
And I think he really does believe in a divinity of that kind of grandeur.
You speak about him in the present tense. Is he alive to you?
Yeah, I think so. I don't talk to him really, but I think about him all the time, where he speaks through his writings in ways, so I'll see something and think of a line from him.
Because you're not saying he believed. You're saying he believes this and he believes that. That's really interesting. You've said that as a teacher, Professor Rowland, you want your students to hear dead people speak. What kind of conversation would they have with Giordano Bruno? What do you hear Bruno saying to them?
I think they'd have to be very patient with his impatience with them. And I think he'd be telling them to think on a huge scale. So that he's like people who talk today about chaos theory, which my father, who's a scientist, reminds me always is not about chaos, it's about extreme complexity. And what he's asking people who learn from him to do is to grasp immense complexity, or to understand that it exists, and what seems to them to be chaos may not be chaos in a larger scheme of things. And then it's ironic that he runs into an inquisition that's beyond his powers because he's denounced by a pupil who's a spoiled Venetian noble who will reveal himself ultimately as a crank. And he can't possibly satisfy the crank because the crank can't be satisfied by definition. Therefore, the crank, in a fit of rage, turns him into the Inquisition, and the great order of the cosmos has a glitch that ends up killing Bruno 7 years later.
This is Tapestry on CBC Radio 1. I'm Mary Hines. If you're listening on satellite radio, you are on Sirius 137. If you're hearing our podcast, hey, welcome to you, wherever you are. My guest is Ingrid Rowland, professor at the University of Notre Dame School of Architecture in Rome. Every year, on the anniversary of Giordano Bruno's death, a group of atheists, the Giordano Bruno Society, gathers in the square where Bruno was burned at the stake as a heretic in the year 1600. And there is a reading of the poem Campo de Fiori by the Polish-American writer Czesław Miłosz.
A Roma, in Campo de Fiori, ceste d'olive e di limoni, schizzi di vino sul selciato.
In Rome, on the Campo de Fiori, baskets of olives and lemons, cobbles spattered with wine and the wreckage of flowers. Vendors cover the trestles with rose-pink fish, armfuls of dark grapes heaped on peach down.
Proprio qui, in questa piazza, Giordano Bruno fu arso. Qui, il rogo acceso dal boia.
On this same square, they burned Giordano Bruno. Henchmen kindled the pyre, close pressed by the mob. Before the flames had died, the taverns were full again. Baskets of olives and lemons again on the vendors' shoulders.
Questi morenti solitari, già dal mondo dimenticati, estranea.
Those dying here, the lonely, forgotten by the world. Our tongue becomes for them the language of an ancient planet, until, when all is legend and many years have passed, on a great Campo de Fiori, rage will kindle at a poet's word.
La prima parola di poeta sul grande Campo dei Fiori accenderà la rivolta.
A member of the Giordano Bruno Society, reading the poem Campo de Fiori by Czesław Miłosz. It's interesting to see the difference in the fate of Galileo vis-a-vis the Vatican and the fate of Giordano Bruno. The Vatican in 1991 admitted that, yes, Galileo was mistreated and he was right, and yes, the earth moves around the sun. When it comes to Giordano Bruno and some of his ideas, it seems the Vatican has eaten a degree of humble pie with Galileo, but has given nothing to Bruno. Is that correct?
And interestingly, last year, the head of the Pontifical Academy of Sciences did an interview for a Catholic periodical called Familia Cristiana, Christian Family, in which he brought up Bruno again and said maybe we should look into Bruno. That piece of news was referred immediately to the two most prominent Bruno scholars in Italy, both of whom are, for their own reasons, rabidly anti-clerical, and they both said nonsense. And my own feeling is that this man must have read something different, and the most recent something different was my book, in which I try to argue that the usual stance, the stance that was taken by the Vatican in 2000, which was the anniversary of Bruno's burning, was that he was a bad Christian, therefore the church could do nothing for him. And I think ultimately the church should be able to overlook that in the way that Bruno says that ultimately God is big enough to pardon even the demons.
Was the sticking point for the church his so-called bad Christianity or his views about the universe? Because you've mentioned he questioned the divinity of Jesus, the virginity of Mary, all the while pointing to the stars and saying, it's infinite. You know, there are so many worlds. It's not just about us. So many worlds out there. Which would have been the bigger transgression, do you think?
I think the personhood of Jesus, which he bases quite rightly in St. Augustine. So he says, Augustine said, person is a new word applied to Jesus relative to God. And I prefer, like Augustine, not to favor it. I think that the second person, if anything, is God's love. So that he offers an alternative reading of what Jesus is. But that, for people who believe that the Pope is the vicar of Christ on earth, who works through the cardinals to bring divinity down to humanity, that's a lot for them to accept. An abstract principle of God's love doesn't do much for your position in a structure.
Well, it shoots the hierarchy to hell, right?
Then I assume that his real problem is that rather than anything else. I don't think the infinite universe is nearly as threatening as his saying, wait a minute.
If we're talking about the divinity of Christ, also the virginity of Mary, the transubstantiation, the communion wafer becoming the body of Christ, in the year 1600, Clearcut Heresy. In the last couple of months, I've interviewed several bishops and former bishops who say they've come to believe pretty much the same thing about divinity or lack thereof, virginity or lack thereof. They'd see Giordano Bruno's theology as being pretty bang on. To what extent was he just 400 years too early?
I think that's his major problem, that he's seen things in a way that we now can accept. The infinity of the universe doesn't detract from God at all. If anything, it magnifies the scope of religion, or gives a whole different key in which to pursue religious faith. And most practicing Catholics that I know have no doubts about the dimensions of the universe. And that's not a problem for them. And so I do think he was simply ahead of his time, and the times in which he lived were so tormented by uncertainty about what the earth was made of, whether the church would survive at all. There are all these people in the New World who were completely different. And there are a lot of insecurities that we've come to live with in our own time now for 400 years. And we don't really worry that the earth we stand on may not be exactly as we perceive it. We're perfectly happy with having gas clouds give birth to planets and stars.
Some of Giordano Bruno's views about the world, about the universe, started with him looking up into the night sky, looking up into the heavens. What can you tell us about Bruno, observer of the sky, Bruno, observer of stars?
In a lot of ways, he saw them as a poet. So what drives some historians of science crazy is his imprecision. He's not really an empiricist who's out there counting the stars. He's using them as a kind of visionary model of an infinite universe rather than saying there are this many stars in this quadrant, therefore the universe must be this big. But he's living in a time where the way you use numbers is changing rapidly from numerology where you just say 3, wow, 4, to saying 3 plus 4 makes 7, and then you could do things with it.
But he's not counting, right? He's not keeping count.
No, and that for many people means that he's not a scientist, and I think that's just a problem of terminology because there were no scientists back then. There were natural philosophers, and inasmuch as he's a philosopher, sometimes he's natural. He talks about himself as having a natural and physical discourse. I think he's actually on the road to calculus, but he couldn't possibly get there by mathematical means because his mathematics isn't sophisticated enough.
On the anniversary of his execution in Rome, the statue in Campo de Fiori becomes this magnet for all kinds of people, atheists, freethinkers, secret lodge members, everybody getting together to salute the man, place a flower at his bronze feet, place a candle there in memoriam. Why, 400 years later, why does he matter?
I think it's partly his sheer courage in sticking to an idea. He's saying that the most important thing in the world is an idea and that that's worth dying for, even when it's an idea that's completely harmless, completely nonviolent. All he's saying is the world is extremely large and complex and therefore extremely beautiful. And yet he thinks that's a statement worth making with his life. And so in a way he gives us a model of what humanity can be, or what our spirits are capable of.
You said something a minute ago that view of immensity needn't lead to an impoverished view of the divine, that in fact it can magnify your view of the divine. And I had this image of the Magnificat, the prayer set against the stars somehow. This idea that it magnifies the glory of everything. I mean, that's where Bruno the poet seems to rise up again.
And I think poetry really can work nicely with science because ultimately some of the responses that we have to scientific discoveries are aesthetic responses. And poets are able to capture that wonder that we still see when things like those photographs from the Hubble telescope of those clouds giving birth to stars. That's just poetry.
He would have loved that.
I hope he's out there in particulate form seeing.
That's right. I shouldn't be using the conditional here. You're using the present tense. I have no business saying Bruno would have done this or that. We need to stick to He's loving this.
Yes, he really would have been delighted. I think he would have had the versatility of mind to adjust to it.
The versatility of mind, yeah. As you imagine his last moments, would any small part of him had been satisfied that his job was done, that what he set out to bring to the world was accomplished?
I imagine so. One of the things that I do is take a statement that he made to his cellmates, which again, the cellmates all go in and tell the Inquisition. He said that our Lord sinned at Gethsemane when he said, "May this cup pass from me." So it's Jesus right before his arrest, knowing that he's probably going to get in terrible trouble with the Roman authorities and that it all may end miserably, says for a moment, if there's any way to get out of this, let me get out of it. And then immediately he picks himself up and says, but if it has to be this way, then thy will be done.
Yes.
And I think Bruno must have pondered that passage, because he gets to the same place where he's absolutely scared to death, knows that he will die and will die painfully, and still decides nonetheless. And if he does that, if he dies true to his beliefs, then he's done something. Whereas if he compromises himself, then he's just going to be a floating island of insignificance.